catalyze and support wetland conservation in South Africa. And for the last 16 years, we've been working very closely with Mondi, as my presentation will cover, largely because they're a very great water user and have a very great impact on wetland ecosystems. So we try to work with them to help reduce that impact of their operations. So when Mondi were asked to present today, they said to me, well, you work very closely with us. We have a very strong partnership of trust with you. So therefore, would you go and present on behalf of us? Which I thought was quite amazing. And I think it's quite a nice indicator to me to realize how strong the partnership that we have between two NGOs and the corporate. That really has kind of developed over obviously quite a long period of time. And it's been through its birthing pains as well. Obviously, like most partnerships, they're not all smooth. They kind of go up and down. So today I'm going to be sharing with you some experiences from the South African operations of Mondi rather than the European operations, because I just work in South Africa, of some of their water stewardship journey, and predominantly with respect to their wetland management and how Mondi are implementing better wetland management practices and trying to reduce the impact of their plantations on these wetlands. But just to provide a little bit of a context to the kind of talk, South Africa is an extremely water-stressed country. At current supply and demand, we simply won't have sufficient water to meet the rising demand by 2025. You can see the map on the left. That's a WIMI map that was developed to project the water scarcity of different countries in 2025. You can see South Africa right down at the bottom. This little red blob is right up there with North Africa, the Middle East, and Mongolia. So we really are a dry country, and often people don't realize this. Most parts of the country are extremely arid, but some parts are extremely wet. And that's where the majority of the water is produced in the country. And that's ironically where the plantation forestry areas are. About 70% of our rivers have been classified by government as being unhealthy and seriously degraded. We estimate that about 55% of our wetlands have been destroyed, where the ecosystem services they're producing have been significantly impacted upon. We have very high levels of poverty, with many millions of South Africans still not having access to potable water. So they still have to go down to rivers and wetlands to draw their water supply. So the quality of the water in these wetlands and rivers are really important to many poor folk. Mondi are one of the largest landowners in the country. They own 350,000 hectares of land in one of the richest water-producing areas of the country, and they grow plantation trees for the pulp and paper industry. Plantation trees in South Africa are exotics from Europe and from Australia, predominantly pines and eucalyptus. They use a lot more water than the indigenous species. And as a result, it's the only crop in the country that's been declared by government as being a stream flow reduction activity, because those plantations use so much water compared to the indigenous vegetation, they actually reduce stream flow. And historically, the plantation forestry industry have actually planted right through wetlands to try and drain extra areas, and right through riparian areas as well. So you can imagine they had a significant impact on wetlands and riparian zones. So they therefore have a very high responsibility to ensure that the wetlands on their land are managed properly and can continue to provide the ecosystem services to the downstream water users. This is an incredibly large business risk to the company. Because we're very water stressed and because plantation forestry has been declared as a stream flow reduction activity, government allocate water use licenses to companies wishing to grow trees. If those areas are not managed sustainably, government can take away that water use license. And in Mondi's case, if their water use license is taken away, they simply won't be able to grow trees. They then won't have the fiber for making their pulp, and they will have to buy from their competitors, which obviously is not a healthy situation to be in. So water is one of the most critical risks to the entire company. So they need to manage this water risk. And they've got 4 pillars in how they're trying to manage the water risk from a wetland protection perspective. First of all, they've developed a state of the wetland report on their 350,000 hectare land, trying to identify where are the key wetlands. They've got about 25,000 hectares of wetlands dotted around their land. They didn't know where all the wetlands were. They didn't know where the significant ones were. They didn't know what ecosystem services those wetlands were providing. So they basically did the state of the wetland report to identify the services, to identify the impact of their plantation forestry operations on those ecosystem services. And then we worked with them to co-develop management recommendations for mitigating those kind of impacts. It's one thing having management recommendations for how land owners should be, or users should be managing the wetlands, another thing implementing them. So we had to develop really simple summary charts like this for senior and middle level management to understand what were the key impacts of the different areas. The rows are the different areas that the company owns. So you'll have the Midlands area and the kind of central part of the country where they grow trees. The columns are some of the impacts that their forestry operations had on the wetlands and riparian areas. I won't go into the reason why roads, cultivation, alien plants are impacts, but this table very simply summarizes for managers that if they're in the Midlands, they have a serious problem with alien invasive plants and they should be doing something about it. Whereas when it comes to the northern KwaZulu-Natal area, they're doing pretty well in managing the alien invasive species. So at a very quick glance, managers can see that in some areas of wetland management, they're doing very well, in others they're doing very poorly. And when implementing the management recommendations, they should be aiming for improved management. So it's a really nice little table where we've taken some very sophisticated and hard science to help develop these recommendations and how the wetlands should be managed better and put them into simple tables for people to understand. So that's the first way of managing the water risk, is try and identify what is the impact of their plantation forestry operations on water, on wetlands and water usage. Secondly, in trying to reduce their water footprint, as I said before, these alien plantation trees use a lot of water and they've been planted historically right through wetlands and riparian areas. Many of our wetlands in South Africa are seasonal. So in the rainy season they'll be very large, in the dry season they'll be very small. So how do you find the boundary of a wetland where it's fluctuating all the time? Well, Mondi worked together with a whole lot of wetland NGOs such as ourselves to try and find a method of drawing the line that everybody agreed to, where the boundary of the wetland was, even though it was fluctuating. And that's very simply by looking at the soils and looking at the plants and looking at the topography. It's quite a complex method, but very simply, those are the key kind of elements. So Mondi really led the way within the forestry industry for developing this method and then delineating all their wetlands and taking all the trees that were incorrectly planted in the wetlands and in the buffer area. This is the wetland, here's the delineation line, the little red line, and there's the area they had to kind of clear to try and reduce the impact of those trees on groundwater as well as surface water that may be flowing over the land. And in that way they could try and reduce their water footprint significantly. Interestingly, Mondi were key in trying to encourage the rest of the plantation forestry industry throughout the country to adopt this method and to do the same thing. And the forestry industry did this because they realized that they needed to reduce the water footprint. And this has a significant economic cost to the company, as well as the entire forestry industry. They estimate they're probably losing about 100 million euros a year in loss of land through clearing these areas. But the benefit of doing that or the cost of doing that is far outweighed by the benefit of retaining the environmental certification through FSC and having access to developed markets like here in Europe. So it's quite interesting that even though they were suffering economically by reducing their planted area, they were still getting greater benefits by having access to markets such as in Europe. So they developed this method, they reduced all their trees and started to apply responsible forestry practices. The third method was, sorry, the title hasn't come out, it's supposed to mean wetland rehabilitation, trying to secure the water security by rehabilitating degraded wetlands. Many wetlands in the plantation forestry area, not just in Mondi but other companies as well, have been drained by previous landowners, maybe maize farmers or dryland rice growers. And you can see here's a wetland that has been drained and totally dried out, and the water hadn't really flooded there probably for the last 60, 70 years. So what Mondi did is they worked together with government, they entered into a co-funding agreement with government where previously unemployed people were employed to rehabilitate degraded wetlands like this. And in this particular example, here's the wetland 2 years later after being rehabilitated. And then last year is a photograph I took of a local fisherman actually fishing in the wetland. So they're trying to rehabilitate those wetlands on their land that have been previously degraded to try and restore the ecosystem functions that those wetlands are providing to downstream water users, and trying to help secure water sources for the country. Obviously funding us, they fund us to the tune of €500,000 a year. We don't just work with Mondi, we work very closely with the plantation sugar industry, which also is another crop that uses a lot of water. We work very closely in developing the capacity of government. We work very closely with private landowners and communal wetland owners as well. So by funding us, Mondi is also trying to make a difference to securing the water resources of the country and to try and minimize their business risk. The fourth and last pillar of trying to mitigate their business risk is trying to strengthen the capacity within the organization. Because interestingly enough, most of the staff in this organization are skilled at growing trees, not managing wetlands. So we've tried to work with them to strengthen their formal learning structures and develop programs within the organization, as well as trying to strengthen their informal learning spaces. Because most learning that takes place within the world actually happens on an informal learning basis, where people learn from each other out in the field, rather than going to universities or schools. So it's trying to provide those spaces where the staff can talk and communicate to each other and learn from each other in how they can improve their practice and collaborate more. Most importantly, sorry, this is also gone a little bit skew. The title there is, why did Mondi do this? What is their main interest in implementing these 4 different pillars? Well, obviously, to try and mitigate against the environmental and the water risks of the company. If they didn't manage the land properly, government could take away the water use license, therefore lose their timber, which was the major fiber source for making pulp. But also to try and ensure that they maintain their social license to operate. Historically, the public were very against the plantation forestry industry because it used so much water. In the last 10 years, that has started to improve as the forestry companies have tried to implement better practice. So to the forestry companies, it's really, really important to maintain the social license to operate by having the public on their side. And there's still a lot of people, I think, that are still very doubtful. But on the main, I think a lot of people are realizing how companies like Mondi and other forestry companies are really trying to make a difference and trying to reduce the impact of their plantation forestry operations as best possible. FSC and legislation obviously were a very big push, and they certainly encouraged companies like Mondi to try and reduce the impact of their plantation forestry operations. But in South Africa and probably many other developing countries, the enforcement of environmental legislation is very poor. So we can't rely on government to enforce the legislation that we have, even though we have really good water-related legislation. But it's not only up to government to try and enforce the legislation and to improve practice, it's up to everybody. And I think this is where companies like Mondi are really trying to move beyond compliance towards self-control and trying to use compliance and legislation as the bare minimum standard, and to try and implement more self-control in implementing their better management practices, because it's the right thing to do. And I think you'll find it's exactly the same with Coke, with Lafarge and the other corporates that have spoken today. It's the right thing to do, and they want to do that because they want to be leaders in the industry. To be a leader, you have to lead. And this is they've acknowledged quite greatly. I think this is pretty well explained in the Mondi Diamond. Mondi have a diamond which are really 5 areas of excellence that they strive towards. And these include things like customer focus, cutting edge products, developing their staff, operational excellence, and sustainability. And the interesting thing is that sustainability isn't a tag-on to these 5 facets of the diamond. It's actually a golden thread that runs throughout all 5. And the CEO, the group CEO of Mondi, is adamant that profit will not come above sustainability. And that's really nice to hear. Obviously, it's one thing for the CEO to say something, and it's another thing for it to be implemented on the ground. And that's why we found, as I'll explain in a minute, middle-level management are critical to really work with and involve in trying to ensure that the instructions from the top actually get implemented on the ground. The last reason for why did Mondi do this, they're also adamant they're not doing it, I think, much like the other corporates we heard, for publicity. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do, and that's why I'm speaking here, they're not speaking. So they're doing it for the real interest in trying to improve the management and the stewardship responsibility that they have through all the wetlands on their land. Lessons learned, my very last slide. I think we couldn't have worked with Mondi to help them improve the management of the wetlands on our own. They couldn't have done it on their own. It's a really nice example of where NGOs and a corporate have worked together over the last 16 years to try and strengthen wetland management, not just within the company, but throughout the country. When I started working on this program, I was the only person working on wetland conservation in the country, and now we have a multi-million-dollar industry employing 2,000 people. And without support from corporates like Mondi, this would never have happened. But the critical part, I think, is this partnership happened because of the trust that we were able to develop between the two NGOs and between the corporate. And trust is always built by individuals. And it's always critical, we found, to have individuals within the company and within the NGOs that can work together and really start something. But then you also need to have the enabling space that's really provided by the corporate culture. The corporate culture of Mondi is one that's very open. If you have a problem with them, tell them what the problem is and they'll work with you to overcome that problem. And I think you find that with most of the corporates that are here. So we found that developing trust between the organizations and having the enabling environment of the corporate culture has enabled this partnership to flourish. And that it's really important to have mature long-term partnerships. We have a very open partnership. We receive funding from them, but we can tell them exactly what we think. And they went through massive restructuring 6-7 years ago. And due to that restructuring, the environmental management went downhill. So we had very open discussions with the CEO and said, we are pulling out of our funding partnership because your poor environmental management is starting to impact significantly on the reputations of WWF and WESA. And because it was a mature partnership, they said, well, this is fantastic. Thanks for telling us. That's why we have you there. You should tell us when things are going wrong, because often we can't see things ourselves. Middle level management was critical. It's all very well working with top level management. It's all very well working with the guys on the ground. But I think this is one area where we need to spend a lot more time working. Everybody kind of forgets about middle level management in an organization. Essentially, they're the ones that translate what the top says to the practice on the ground. And in Mondi, they call the middle level management the permafrost layer, where directions come from the top and bounce off the middle layer back up. And ideas come from the bottom and hit the top or the middle layer and bounce down again. So it's critical to work with that middle level management to actually bring about social change on the ground. What we have ironically found is that a lot of Mondi's customers, banks, large paper distributors, have come to Mondi and said, we want you to prove that and show us in the field how your forestry practices are not having a significant impact on freshwater resources. Mondi were quite amazed that the customers actually asking, they're quite used to NGOs like ourselves kind of pressurizing them. So we took them out and showed the corporates, the customers, what Mondi was actually doing to try and mitigate the impact of plantation, forestry operations and wetlands. And interesting enough, this provided a nice safe space where the customers and Mondi could get to know each other better and discuss environmental issues, whereas normally the customers and Mondi are haggling about prices of paper. Customers trying to get the cheapest price, Mondi trying to get the highest price. So it actually provided a nice safe environment for developing strong relations, which has now had a significant impact on the customer's decision and where they actually buy paper. So this is a nice spin-off that we didn't really expect. And the last and probably most important lesson that we've learned is that we found that sustainability is not an end point. It's a continual journey of reflecting and learning, and the goalposts are moving all the time. What's best management practice today is worst management practice tomorrow. So it's really important to, in your sustainability practices, have a very strong reflection and learning component. Because if you're practicing but not learning, you're not improving. And you're not implementing sustainability practices. So we found that sustainability is a social learning process where people learn from each other. Is more important than sustainability as an expert, predetermined, transferable product, like a policy or guidelines. Because you might have the best policy and guidelines and it's often not implemented. So the key is kind of trying to bridge that gap between people having the knowledge and the technological knowledge being out there to implement better management practices and the lack of implementation on the ground. And it's one of the biggest problems that we have today is that gap. Despite people knowing what the problems are and having the knowledge to overcome them, often that doesn't result in the action on the ground. So that's what we're trying to do, is close that gap. And we found that seeing sustainability of the social learning process is one way of trying to close that gap. So thank you very much.